People laughed when he built a shed around his house, and at first, no one in the small frontier settlement could understand why he was wasting time, labor, and precious lumber on something that seemed so pointless. Winters in northern Minnesota were already cruel enough, and most families focused only on chopping wood, sealing log gaps, and praying their fires would last through the cold months. While others hurried indoors before dark, this man worked outside in freezing temperatures, hammering boards into place with calm focus. Neighbors shook their heads as they passed, whispering that the winter had finally driven him mad. Some said he was building a barn by mistake, others joked that he was making a house just for air. Yet he never argued, never explained in detail. He simply kept building, confident that winter itself would answer the laughter. The man's name was Olaf Henriksen, a quiet Norwegian immigrant who had arrived with little more than tools, experience, and patience. Back in Norway, Olaf had spent many years working as a shipwright, building wooden fishing vessels that had to survive relentless cold, salt water, and storms. Ships taught him lessons most homesteaders never learned. He understood that wood did not fail because of cold alone, but because of trapped moisture. He knew that air, when allowed to move correctly, could protect a structure instead of weakening it. These ideas stayed with him when he settled in Minnesota, even though the land was different and the winters harsher than anything most people had known. During his first winter on the frontier, Olaf watched closely. He noticed that families burned huge amounts of firewood and still struggled to stay warm. He noticed smoke filling cabins, children coughing, and chimneys clogging with creosote. Most importantly, he noticed that nearly all firewood was damp. Snow melted into it, wind pushed moisture deep into the stacks, and freezing temperatures locked that moisture inside. When burned, the wood hissed and steamed, wasting precious heat just to dry itself before it could even burn properly. People blamed the cold, but Olaf saw a different problem. The fight against winter was being lost before the fire was even lit. Instead of talking, Olaf planned. He measured his small log cabin carefully and decided to build a second structure around it, leaving a wide air gap between the two. This outer shell was not meant to be airtight. In fact, he left deliberate gaps near the ground and near the roofline. Snow and rain would hit the outer boards, not the cabin itself. Wind would slow as it passed through the space, losing its force. Inside that gap, Olaf planned to store firewood where it could stay dry, protected, and slowly season all winter long. To outsiders, it looked like waste. To Olaf, it was a system. By the time winter fully arrived, the shed around his house was finished. The ridicule grew louder. At gatherings, men openly criticized his choices. They counted the extra lumber and declared it foolish. They said heat would escape faster through two walls than one. Some even warned his wife that they would suffer for his stubbornness. Still, Olaf said little. He stacked his firewood carefully inside the gap, placing each log upright so air could move freely around it. Snow piled against the outer walls, but the space inside remained sheltered and dry. Then winter came with a fury no one expected. Temperatures dropped far below zero, and a massive blizzard swept across the region. Winds howled for days, burying cabins and cutting families off from one another. Inside most homes, fires burned constantly. People fed their stoves every few minutes, yet the cold crept in anyway. Wood supplies disappeared at alarming speed. Worse, the wood was soaked with ice and snow, burning poorly and filling homes with smoke. Some families burned green wood out of desperation, sacrificing heat for survival. Inside Olaf's cabin, the experience was very different. His firewood, stored in the protected air gap, was dry and light. When he placed it in the hearth, it caught quickly and burned hot. The stone around the fireplace absorbed the heat and slowly released it back into the room. Instead of frantic feeding, Olaf added wood calmly, every 40 minutes or so. The temperature inside stayed steady and comfortable while the storm raged outside. His children played on the floor without coats. His wife cooked without numb fingers. The shed did not look foolish anymore, but most neighbors did not yet know that. On the second day of the blizzard, one of the loudest critics forced his way through the snow to check on Olaf's family. He expected misery. Instead, warm air spilled out the moment the door opened. The sight shocked him. He saw dry wood stacked neatly near the fire, no smoke in the room, and children laughing. He did not argue or mock this time. He asked one simple question: how? Olaf answered just as simply: dry wood burns hot. Hot fires need less fuel. The rest was preparation. When the storm finally passed, the settlement emerged exhausted and shaken. Many families had burned through more than half their winter wood supply in just a few days. Some wood piles were ruined beyond use, frozen solid with ice. Olaf's supply remained almost untouched. Word spread quickly. People began to compare notes, quietly at first. They noticed that Olaf's cabin walls were dry, free from frost damage. They noticed his family was healthier, coughing less, sleeping better. A few weeks later, the same neighbor who had mocked Olaf asked to measure everything. Temperatures, wood use, moisture levels, nothing was left to guesswork. Day after day, the numbers told the same story. Olaf's home stayed significantly warmer while using far less firewood. His wood contained far less moisture, meaning more heat and less smoke. The evidence was impossible to deny. The laughter faded, replaced by uncomfortable silence and then honest curiosity. When the results were shared publicly, pride finally gave way to truth. Men who had built cabins for decades admitted they had been wrong. They realized the shed was not extra waste, but an investment. The lumber used would pay for itself in just a few winters through saved fuel alone. Beyond that, the structure extended the life of the cabin, protected tools and supplies, and created a healthier living space for families. What once looked like madness now looked like wisdom. Over the next few years, more families copied the idea. Variations appeared, adapted to different needs and budgets. The design spread quietly, not through advertisements or books, but through lived experience. Winters became more manageable. Wood lasted longer. Homes stayed warmer and drier. Children grew healthier. Decades later, building scientists would rediscover the same principles under new names, calling them ventilated walls and moisture-managed facades. Olaf had simply applied what he already knew: wood must breathe, water must be kept away, and air can be a powerful ally when used correctly. People stopped laughing because winter had changed their minds. The shed around the house became a symbol of something deeper. It reminded everyone that tradition is not the same as truth, and that observation can be more powerful than assumption. Olaf never claimed to be an inventor or genius. He just paid attention, trusted experience, and let results speak louder than opinions. In the end, the shed did more than protect firewood. It protected families, health, and dignity in a land where winter showed no mercy. The years that followed the Great Blizzard marked a slow but powerful transformation in Pine Ridge, one that did not happen overnight and did not announce itself loudly. Change rarely does. It arrives quietly, settles into habits, and only later does anyone realize how different life has become. After that first winter proved Olaf right, the settlement did not suddenly turn into a place of innovation and open-minded thinking. Pride does not disappear so easily. But something important had cracked. The certainty that tradition alone was enough no longer felt solid. Spring brought thawed ground and long conversations. Men who once laughed now found reasons to walk past Olaf's property, pretending to inspect fences or fields while studying the outer shell around his cabin. They noticed details they had ignored before. The way snowmelt ran harmlessly away from the structure. The way the inner cabin logs looked dry and clean even after months of brutal cold. They noticed that Olaf's chimney needed less cleaning, that his roof showed fewer ice problems, that his tools did not rust the way theirs did. None of these things alone were dramatic, but together they formed a pattern that could not be unseen. Eventually, questions replaced jokes. How wide was the gap? Why not seal it completely? Why place vents near the roof? Olaf explained patiently, using simple language. He spoke of ships again, of how wood trapped between tight boards rotted faster than wood exposed to moving air. He explained that air, when slowed but not trapped, acted like a blanket rather than a thief of heat. He showed how moisture escaped upward, how snow stayed outside where it belonged, how dry fuel changed everything inside the hearth. He never used scientific terms. He spoke from experience, from watching wood live or die. Some men accepted the explanation quickly. Others needed proof they could build themselves. That summer, small experiments began. A shed wall added on one side of a cabin. A covered air space built only for firewood. Even these partial attempts brought noticeable results. Wood stayed lighter. Fires started easier. Smoke thinned. Confidence grew not because Olaf said so, but because winter confirmed it again. By the second winter after the blizzard, Pine Ridge looked different. Not dramatically, but subtly. Smoke rose straighter from chimneys instead of hugging the ground. Fewer men chopped wood in desperation during January. Nights were quieter, less broken by coughing children or the constant clatter of fire pokers. Families still worked hard, but the work felt purposeful instead of frantic. There was a difference between effort and struggle, and people were beginning to feel it. As comfort increased, so did cooperation. Neighbors helped one another build outer structures, trading labor instead of money. Olaf became a guide, walking from homestead to homestead, pointing out mistakes before they were made. He insisted on proper airflow, on roof overhangs wide enough to throw water far from the foundation. He warned against sealing gaps too tightly, reminding them that still air was not the goal. Protected air was. Not everyone followed his advice perfectly. Some built sheds too close, others blocked airflow out of fear. Those houses improved only slightly, and that too became a lesson. People learned that copying the shape without understanding the purpose led to disappointment. The design demanded respect for principles, not blind imitation. Health changes became harder to ignore. The settlement's doctor visited less often in winter. Cases of chest illness declined. Older residents, who once dreaded January, found they could sleep through the night without waking to add wood every hour. Women noticed less mold on stored food, less dampness in clothing, fewer ruined supplies. These were not luxuries. On the frontier, they were survival. As the years passed, new families arrived, drawn by the region's stability. They noticed the unusual buildings immediately. At first, they asked the same questions Olaf's neighbors once had. Why waste lumber? Why build twice? This time, the answers did not come from Olaf alone. They came from dozens of voices, each with their own story of fuel saved, sickness avoided, winters endured with dignity instead of fear. The shed house became part of Pine Ridge's identity. Jacob Lindstrom, once the loudest critic, became the strongest advocate. He refined the design, adjusting proportions, experimenting with different woods, even testing removable panels for summer airflow. He documented what worked and what failed. His pride had transformed into discipline. He taught younger builders not just how to build, but how to think. Measure first. Observe second. Judge last. By the early 1890s, the idea spread beyond Pine Ridge. Travelers carried the story. Some exaggerated it, turning Olaf into a folk hero. Others dismissed it as a local curiosity. But where the design was tried honestly, it worked. Scandinavian communities adopted it fastest, recognizing echoes of old country wisdom adapted to new extremes. American-born settlers followed more slowly, but hunger for survival is persuasive. An agricultural agent eventually arrived to document the phenomenon. He measured temperatures, calculated fuel use, and interviewed families. His report did something important. It translated lived experience into numbers others could trust. He did not call it genius. He called it efficient. That word mattered. Efficiency appealed even to skeptics. It promised savings, longevity, control. Meanwhile, Olaf continued his quiet life. He did not patent anything. He did not seek recognition. He worked his land, repaired tools, and prepared for winter as he always had. His shed house aged gracefully. The outer shell weathered storms, sacrificing itself slowly so the inner cabin remained untouched. Olaf understood this trade. The outer wall was meant to be replaced someday. The cabin was meant to endure. Years later, when younger men asked why he never sealed the shed tight or insulated it with moss, Olaf smiled. Because trapped water is worse than cold, he said. Cold can be fought. Rot cannot. That sentence stayed with many who heard it. Some would repeat it decades later without remembering where it came from. Children who grew up in shed houses became adults who assumed winter preparation was normal, not heroic. They planned months ahead. They stored wood properly. They built with air and water in mind. When they moved elsewhere, they carried those habits with them. Some tried to explain them. Others simply built quietly and let results speak. As building methods advanced and materials changed, the principle remained. Even when sawmills replaced axes and insulation replaced air gaps, the idea of protecting structures from moisture while allowing them to breathe stayed relevant. Engineers would later give it formal names, but Olaf had never needed names. He needed warmth, dry wood, and a house that would not betray him. In January, near the end of his life, Olaf watched younger generations debate new technologies with the same certainty his neighbors once had. He rarely interrupted. He had learned that wisdom often arrives only after winter does its teaching. When asked what he thought of modern ideas, he answered carefully. Some will work, he said. Some will not. The cold will decide. When Olaf passed away, his shed house still stood strong. It had sheltered decades of winters without complaint. When his children eventually dismantled the outer shell to expand the home, they found the inner cabin almost untouched by time. Logs were solid. Joints were clean. The house looked as though it had been built yesterday, not generations earlier. The laughter that once followed Olaf had long since vanished, but its lesson remained. People remembered how easily they had dismissed something unfamiliar. How quickly confidence had turned into error. And how quietly truth had corrected them. The shed around the house was never really about wood or walls. It was about paying attention. About respecting how nature works instead of fighting it blindly. About understanding that survival often depends not on doing more, but on doing better. Winter had changed their minds, but it had also changed their habits, their health, and their future. And all of it began with one man willing to be laughed at long enough for the cold to prove him right. As time moved forward, the story of Pine Ridge quietly faded from daily conversation, yet its influence never truly disappeared. What had once been a strange experiment became an unspoken standard, woven so deeply into everyday life that people stopped thinking of it as innovation at all. The shed house was no longer Olaf's idea. It was simply the way things were done by those who had learned to respect winter rather than challenge it blindly. The children who had grown up in those protected homes carried something invisible with them into adulthood. They carried calm. They had never known the panic of watching firewood vanish too quickly, never known the fear of listening to the wind howl while the fire struggled to stay alive. To them, winter was harsh, yes, but it was predictable. And predictability is power in a cold land. When they married and built homes of their own, even in distant settlements, they instinctively planned storage, airflow, and moisture protection before worrying about appearance. They built for survival first, comfort second, and pride last. Some of them moved west. Others went south. A few stayed and became builders, farmers, or traders. Wherever they went, they carried habits learned without formal lessons. They stacked wood carefully. They hated dampness. They understood that smoke inside a home was not normal, no matter how cold it was outside. Many could not explain why they did these things in technical language, but they could explain the result. It works, they would say. And often, that was enough. Back in Pine Ridge, the original shed houses aged like old trees. Some outer shells were replaced, others repaired. A few were removed when families grew and needed more space. But even when the outer walls disappeared, the lessons did not. Those families still stored wood under cover. They still extended roofs farther than neighboring towns. They still allowed buildings to breathe instead of sealing them tight out of fear. The shed might vanish, but its thinking remained. Visitors occasionally asked why Pine Ridge seemed different. Why homes looked sturdier. Why winters felt less desperate there than in places not far away. The answers were usually simple. We learned the hard way, people would say. Or, we don't fight winter anymore. We prepare for it. Rarely did anyone mention Olaf by name. Not out of disrespect, but because his ideas had become shared knowledge, no longer belonging to one man. Decades later, when industrial materials became common and new building styles arrived, some people tried to abandon the old ways entirely. They sealed houses tightly, trusting new products to solve old problems. For a while, things seemed easier. Fires burned hotter. Walls looked cleaner. But moisture crept back in quietly, just as Olaf had once warned. Mold appeared. Wood softened. Repairs became expensive. Slowly, builders rediscovered what had been forgotten. They began talking about ventilation again. About moisture control. About letting structures dry instead of trapping water inside them. In books and manuals, these ideas gained new names and diagrams. They were presented as modern discoveries, backed by studies and formulas. Few authors knew they were describing something a Norwegian shipwright had quietly proven on the Minnesota frontier nearly a century earlier. Fewer still understood that the real breakthrough was not the design itself, but the willingness to trust observation over assumption. Occasionally, a historian or researcher would stumble across Pine Ridge's old records. They would notice how early the community adopted practices that matched modern building science. They would photograph the remaining structures, measure air gaps, and marvel at the condition of the inner cabins. Some of these researchers wrote articles. Others gave lectures. A few even traveled to see the last standing shed houses in winter, stepping inside and feeling the difference for themselves. Almost all of them came away with the same quiet realization: progress does not always move forward in a straight line. Sometimes it circles back to rediscover what once worked. For the descendants of those early families, the shed house became a story told not to boast, but to remind. It was told when young people laughed at something unfamiliar. It was told when someone dismissed an idea without testing it. It was told when pride threatened to overrule evidence. The moral was never shouted. It was implied. Listen first. Observe longer. Decide later. In old age, some remembered Olaf not as a hero, but as a steady presence. A man who worked without drama. Who let winter do the arguing for him. They remembered how he never said, "I told you so," even when proven right. That restraint earned him a respect louder than any victory speech could have. The land itself seemed to remember as well. Pine Ridge endured storms, floods, droughts, and change. It grew, shrank, and adapted. But it never returned to the desperation it once knew. Winter remained dangerous, but no longer mysterious. People understood its rules now, and that, perhaps, was the greatest legacy of all. Not the shed. Not the saved wood. Not even the warmth. It was the understanding that survival improves when people stop assuming they already know everything. When they allow humility to stand beside experience. When they accept that sometimes the person being laughed at is simply seeing what others have not yet learned to notice. Winter had changed their minds once. Time ensured they would never forget why.